It's my honor to actually introduce Nathan over here. Nathan is the chair for the DMBA program at CCA, out of which I'm graduating this weekend. So definitely, he's been my role model for last decade. He's an experienced designer, and I started my career following what he's been doing. And so, and I have to say, thankfully, it has led me here. So it's my honor. Today he will be talking in prepping for his new book, which is Make It So, which is very much about how sci-fi influences the interface design. And this morning when I was reading the newspaper, I saw a little piece where you could actually chat with somebody in the real life full-size form, and it kind of reminded me of Star Trek, like you could literally have a person and be interacting with that person. So a lot of advancements currently are happening in terms of where sci-fi actually is taking into like some real life interface design or interaction designs. So with that, I would like to have Nathan talk about what he has to say about it.
Let me do a quick switcheroo here. It'll take a moment to load. So thank you, Dolly. Actually, I'm the one that's honored to be here. It's been a long time since I've been, and I realized walking into the theater, like, oh my God, it's been way too long since I've been here. So now I'm thinking in the back of my head how I need to figure out how to come down here more often, because this is the nexus for the interface, interaction, experience design community in the entire Bay Area. There is nothing else. And I grew up in my career coming to here to see the people that inspired me. So I'm honored actually to be here. And I actually think, you don't know how hard this program is that I run up in San Francisco. Dolly deserves a hand for graduating after 2 years of incredible work. She's a superstar in our program. So I'm going to talk about nothing that I've done in the past, nothing that I'm doing now, except this side project that my co-author Chris Noessel and I have been working on for about 5.5 years now. I got the idea for this project coming home on Caltrain from San Francisco to Palo Alto back in about 1988, 89, because we were starting to see back then some interesting things happening with interface design in science fiction. And I got this idea, like, well, maybe we should categorize all this stuff, or at least get the video clips, which was really difficult to do back then. And it wasn't until about 5.5 years when I teamed up with Chris Noessel, who's a managing director at Cooper in San Francisco, that we actually started in earnest. We've been watching a lot of science fiction. Oh, here. Oh, see, there we go. Okay, better. We've had lots of audio-visual stuff. So we started in earnest, and we've been watching a lot of science fiction for the last 5.5 years. We've actually been watching science fiction for a combined almost 70 years or 80 years or something like that. And this has been by far the coolest project I've ever worked on. So I'm going to move through really quickly. We don't have tons of time, and I could spend hours up here showing you cool things. But I'm going to take you through a little bit of the process, and then I'm going to show you the relationship between sci-fi and the real world, and through a lot of different examples. Hopefully it will be illuminating. Okay, so we're really interested in how design affects science fiction and science fiction affects design. And by design, it probably helps to define some terms here. By design, we're really talking about interaction design, so things moving, and how people interact with different kinds of interfaces. To some extent, industrial design, because sometimes the form of the interaction has a great deal to do with the ease of the interaction, and then a lot about information design and things that happen on screen. So we're really talking about interface design. Another way to say that might be screen design, although there are moments when it pops out of the screen. On the sci-fi side, a better term here is actually speculative fiction, but that's not a term that most people know, and sci-fi is a good hook. And what that means is just speculative interfaces. But in order to work within the context of design and interaction design, we've had to narrow down even what that is. So it has to be visual. We have to be able to see it. So that cuts out books, right? Because when I read a passage in a science fiction novel, what I imagine might be going on may be very different than what's going on when you read the passage, and that just sort of screws up the whole process. Not that you couldn't find inspiration, but for the kind of investigation that we wanted to do, books and text wasn't gonna really help us. It had to be moving so that we could see the interaction, and that mostly cut out most forms of sort of graphic novels and even some animation. Partly because the consistency between one scene and another, unless it was computer-generated animation like you might see in Pixar, the drawing from one scene to another might be different, and then that changes the interpretation of how the interface is working, because maybe the artist doesn't really care so much about the interface and sort of fudges some details. But as a professional that we're trying to pull lessons out of, that would present a challenge and a problem to us in our investigation. So we're really looking at screen sci-fi, stuff we can see mostly in television and films. But the caveat is, and the reason why this is really speculative fiction, is that we can compare to things that are out on the real world, and then we can look at other kinds of speculative fiction like industrial films, Knowledge Navigator, and now these kinds of videos that pop up from even small firms, which are total fiction, total speculation, still have something to teach us. They may be looking at a much more near term than a lot of the films and television series that we watch, but there's fundamentally no real difference between what they're producing and what we might find in Star Trek. Maybe they're trying to be a little bit more real, and maybe they have a use case behind it, or maybe not even for that. So we're looking at screen sci-fi, we're looking at essentially interface design, interface sci-fi, and we've watched a lot of stuff. We've cataloged it, we have a huge database, we've done tag clouds. One of Chris's favorite things about this screen and the tag cloud is that if you're really searching for a definitive definition of sci-fi, which there is very little agreement out there in the literature world, for our purposes, sci-fi glows, and it's often blue, and that's sort of enough for us. So there's a relationship between these two worlds that is reciprocal and shows us some categories of learning, categories of lessons. The first thing is that people in the design world, like us, will see stuff in science fiction and will be inspired by it and create something, maybe modeled after it or shaped like that, that we see, et cetera. And conversely, there's stuff in the real world that science fiction production designers and directors and writers and other people involved with creating science fiction see and then are inspired by. Sometimes they pull them directly and put it on the set because it looks a little sci-fi. You see a lot of sort of modern furniture show up in films just because it's easy, right? But in the interface even, we see the same kinds of inspiration happening. But it's largely on an individual level. A production designer on a film sees something in the world, it influences what they create. Usually they have to work fairly quickly. Or a designer, as I'll show you, sees something in science fiction, has an aha moment, and then creates something. It's not more systemic than that. It's just sort of collections of anecdotes. What we also see is that in this real world affecting design, there's an overall theme that is very apparent, and that is that the paradigms that are set by the opportunities in the real world, the stuff that's in our world and how it works, sets a boundary layer, a foundation for what sci-fi developers can actually show. Because if they get too far away from the real world and the paradigms we know as an audience, we don't know what's going on. Anyone ever see Dune? How many people saw Dune? Now, how many people saw Dune, keep your hands up, and read the novels? Okay, so not nearly as many. Now, how many people saw Dune and understood what the hell was going on? Yeah, right? Because they stretched beyond the paradigm, not just of interfaces or whatever and technology, they stretched beyond the paradigms of just culture and narrative. We couldn't figure out what's going on. So this is a little bit of a constraint for at least people in sci-fi that want to keep their audiences around either for the next series or the next episode or the next film or even for the box office of that film. Conversely, the other way around, science fiction is influencing design in three sort of more specific ways than just inspiration. It sets expectations of audiences and what should be available, what's natural, what's obvious. It responds to the social context around us in culture. And then finally, every now and then, it will propose a new paradigm that someone will say, wow, that's awesome, let's make one. And then that becomes a paradigm in the real world eventually, if you're lucky. So we'll see examples all the way through all of this. Let me make sure that we're... Ooh. Okay. I know it's a little annoying, and I'm not sure it'll get a lot better. Okay, so let's head into the first science fiction film, Le Voyage de la Lune. God, it just gets worse, doesn't it? It's all in this little plug. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Yes, it is. Let's hope that works. So this is 1909 or 1902. A French film. Yay, there we go. So what we see here that's really interesting is, at this point, we see no interfaces as we would term them today. You want to send a man to the moon, you put him in a bullet-like, there's that paradigm thing, you put him in a bullet-like capsule and shoot them to the moon. As we'll see in a moment, you'll see this very famous image. If you saw Hugo, let's see the movie, the image from the movie in a second. Bam. So you want to open the door, you push on the door. There's not even a doorknob, and those things existed in the real world, the world of both the audience and the creators here. So there's really no interfaces here. And that's an interesting and an important thing to note at this turn of the century, at this moment, because interfaces, designers essentially have no, it sort of just comes and goes, doesn't it? Or I can just, it doesn't even do that. Like that? Okay, but I'm going to be using it constantly all the way through. That's the problem. It's not the dongle, it's the problem, it's the audio. Okay, so here we are just a few years later, about 20 years later, the film Metropolis. Jeez. Sorry? Same thing. It's literally the mini jack here. Okay. Here what we see is actually a really interesting device. He comes in, the first thing he does is check the ticker tape for messages, and then goes up to one of these devices and picks up a phone. First he sort of tunes in a station, which is this communication station, and then he picks up a phone to talk. So it's a mishmash actually of different kinds of paradigms that at this time made sense, but we look at today and say, oh, that's kind of weird and quaint. He had all these different things. He could have just done it the way we do it now, except they didn't envision that yet. I don't know what to do there. I could do that. Okay, we'll scope the audio until it's absolutely necessary.
We can use a handheld mic if necessary.
To here?
To
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, so that was 1927. Here we'll come into 1939, so just about 10 years later, a little bit. I think, well...
Rogers must prevail on Saturnians. Lend them a spaceship to return to Earth. That's no Saturnian craft, Doctor.
In fact, we're going to
It's
do
one of
stereo.
Killer Kane's spaceships. Possible. I know that type of ship too well to be mistaken.
So what's
Have
happening
you tried
here
to contact them on our wavelength?
is a different paradigm. Now we have this sort of integrated viewer, and he's switching channels as opposed to sort of tuning something in. And what's happened in the interim 12 years or so is television. Now that the audience understands that television, what it is, and maybe not everyone owns one, but they've seen it, now that's a paradigm we can use in media, in narrative, because we're not going to lose people. They get what's going on, and we don't have to do these weird mishmashes. I'm sorry? The gate? The, he has a cape. I mean, I don't have an explanation for the cape, and that's actually not Buck Rogers. He's a general. I guess that's how they decided generals would would wear. Doesn't make a lot of sense to us now, but that was likely a signal or a trigger for importance back then. So these paradigms are really important, and just so that you don't think that that's just in the past and we don't need to do that anymore, here we are in 1993. Very famous scene that many of us will probably know.
It's a unit system. I know this. It's all the files of the whole park. It tells you everything. I gotta find the right file.
Trying to reach the gun.
Here was this novel interface that most people had never seen before,
I can't get it unless I
but it was actually a real shipping product. Sorry, there. So I wanted to stop here for a reason. It's kind of a weird shot to jump down to, especially in this moment of tension. Why do we have to see her moving the mouse on the desktop? Now today, it just like, what a throwaway, what a waste of film, right? But back then, 1993, desktop computers with GUIs were still really new. A lot of people hadn't been using them or hadn't even been exposed to them. They're still using DOS, they're still using command line interfaces, etc. So this establishing shot is there to explain to the audience, anyone that doesn't get what's going on, how she's manipulating this, super cool graphic navigator, just in case someone's left behind, because the filmmakers don't want that question to be lingering and then disrupt following the narrative. So this stuff still has to be done. It has to be done today, although we have much richer interfaces at our abilities in our worlds, and we have these devices that actually seem more sci-fi than most sci-fi. It's not as needed as much as it has in the past, but there are still moments when you show new paradigms that you have to do this, or else you lose your audience. So let's look at individual inspiration. And I have a couple examples of this. This is the Visual Human project. This is from 1989, and they froze a cadaver and sliced it, diced it, and MRI'd it, and X-rayed it, and CAT scanned it. And it's this really interesting project. This is a shot coming through as we're moving through the slices. It's a whole database online, and here we are moving through an entire body. And we're going to stop at this moment right about there. Stopping there for a reason. Take a look and keep your eyes on the screen here. It's from X2, essentially 13 years later. Look at something, see something familiar? We see a lot of this in most movie production, but especially sci-fi, where people just liberally take, it's called scrap. But they see something that they like, and so they incorporate it. They're inspired by what they see. This is just literally like grab and go. This other example that I'm going to show you from the art world, Damien Hirst back in around 1996, and for a couple years before and after, had a series of art pieces where he taxidermied, actually not even taxidermied, just pickled a lot of animals and sliced them, and they're sitting in formaldehyde. And it's pretty visually striking. If you've ever seen the film The Cell, anyone ever see this movie? Visually beautiful, like one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. It's really worth taking a look. This is a scene from The Cell in 2000. Look familiar? So it's a kind of freaky movie. You're in the head of a serial killer, but it's really beautiful and cool. And what you see here is, since it's all CGI, it's not a real animal, you can do really cool things like the heart is still beating, and you can see the lungs going, right? So we see these kinds of, this is really more homage than just rip-off. And these are examples of the kinds of things that we see in places like science fiction and film and television, et cetera, that are just directly either influenced by or just lifted into, in the real world, lifted into science fiction. So that's all we're going to cover on that upper half, because the really interesting things and the lessons are here on the lower half. So we're going to look at that inspiration influence again, but going the other way. People seeing things in sci-fi and then trying to build them in the real world. And this is an interesting story, also from 2000.
Magneto's here, Liberty Island. Now, presumably, his objective is to mutate the world leaders at the UN summit on...
So this is a really interesting, and right at the end of the scene, they're planning their battle. But what was cool about the story is that there was a man named Douglas Caldwell who is sitting in the audience with his teenage son. He didn't really want to go see this film, but he's trying to do things with his son. And at this moment, he looks up and says, "Oh my God, that's what I do. I make those." This is a guy that works at the Pentagon for the Army Corps of Engineers, working in a division called sand tables. They're still called sand tables because they were originally made out of sand, and generals would sort of play in the sand and plan their battles. At that point in 2000, they were a lot more sophisticated. They looked like train models. They had trees and they used pieces, and they would make these things sort of solidified. They'd make literally models of terrain and then ship them to the battle zone so generals could plan. And it would get to the battle zone, and maybe their intelligence was accurate, maybe it wasn't so, or maybe it wasn't still the way it was just moments ago. So it was, very atom heavy, very laborious, and very costly. He sees this on the screen, he's like, that's what we really need. So he goes back to the Pentagon the next day, writes an RFP, references this scene in this film in a Pentagon RFP, hires a company, they work for a couple years, and this is what they build. This is the Xenovision Xenotran Mark III. It works just like those pin boards that you might have played with as a kid. I don't know if kids still play with those things. There's probably an iPad app that sort of is like that. And this is using our technology, not the sort of whiz-bang future technology that the X-Men have. But they did one better, and that is that they put a top on it that had a rubber sheet, basically, and they vacuum out the inside so that and then they can project on top, because now they have a sort of white canvas, but you'll see that this satellite projection will suck down into the terrain that's created by all these little magnetic pins. And so it's just a pin board with a projector on it, but it's still pretty cool, and it's actually kind of cooler than what we just saw in X-Men. And this happened because of because the right person was in the right theater watching the right movie. It's absolutely everything that we sort of thought we'd find when we started this project. And I'm sure they've advanced it since then. So there's an example of sci-fi influencing a real product. And there's other versions of this as well. There's other examples, but I'm not going to show you everything. Let's look at expectation. I'm going to cover this one fairly quickly. This is The Earth Stood Still, very famous. Not the first robot, but probably one of the most influential robots. So what's interesting, he comes in and helps his master, etc. Also, what's really interesting about this film, gesture interfaces. So Klaatu's entire film, or entire ship, just slightly later in this scene, all run by gestures. We think gestures are so new, and Minority Report. Here we are at 1951. This is the first instance of gestures in science fiction. What's interesting about this era is this is the robot era. So we saw robots back in Metropolis, whatever. This is really where robots took hold culturally in the United States, and now we sort of see them everywhere. I'm not going to, iRobot, and now we build stuff like this in order to make them real. And part of the reason why, here's Asimo, he's actually a total feat of engineering, and this is 2005. I mean, the versions that are out now are just astounding what they can do. But there's this weirdness around robots that, why do we need them? Because why does it have to look like a person? Why does it have to be, well, if you were going to develop something that automated the delivery of coffee down a hallway, it doesn't need to look like this. It could be a cart that follows a line in the carpet, or a magnetic thing, or RFID. There's no reason for it to be like this. In fact, we can't really find many uses for these kinds of robots yet, certainly not in the commercial world. But what's driving the billions of dollars of building this stuff, we're learning all kinds of cool things about technology along the way, is our expectations from science fiction. From the 50s on, we were told, goddammit, that we were going to have robots, and we're going to make them. Now, nobody's been able to make the flying cars, not really, thankfully, because we have enough accidents now. Can you imagine your neighbors in a flying car? We don't really want to live in that world. And jetpacks we haven't seen, but we sort of feel like we're promised these things. And it's driving a lot of the budgets in research labs simply because we have this expectation that it should be so. Another better, sort of more commercial example is this really wonderful thing
Captain,
seen
I've
from
lost
Star
contact
Trek.
with the ship. I was talking to them. Suddenly it went dead.
So they're on AT&T still in the 24th century.
Scott.
This is great because he's like, gives it to IT. Yeah, they don't know either. So what's interesting about this is look at the date, 1966. And we have, Mary's here from IFTF, and IFTF, Paul Sappho, who was one of the founders of IFTF, has a famous sort of quote about it takes 30 years for a technology, once it's introduced, to actually sort of make it in the world and come out as a popular mainstream technology or a product. So 1966 to 1996, 30 years to the year, we have the Motorola StarTAC, get it? StarTAC flip phone. It was the first flip phone. And I maintain that this is like 30 years of focus group testing. Because when it hit the market, nobody needed to learn how to use it. It was immediately accepted. And that's not usually the case for a lot of new technologies. We know anecdotally from stories of people in Motorola on the production team that they actually referenced Star Trek and the communicator. So this is setting their expectations, not just for the audience, but as engineers and designers and developers, this is something they're trying to create because it's something that they saw growing up. It was established as this is a good solution. Now, we don't have a lot of these solutions anymore because we've moved to, touch-based bricks, and they don't fold very well. But for a long time, these phones took over because we've been trained to use them for, at this 96, it was 30 years. Here, it's practically 50 years, right? That's one example of expectation. Another one, you could trace the lineage of pad use, right? So here we are in 1987. The pad, literally they call it the pad. It's a personal access display device from Star Trek Next Generation. And we see very many versions of this, and they're touchscreen, and they're sort of all the cool things that we see today. And then, of course, 2010, we get the iPad. But back then, I'm going to skip over this. We see it in The Incredibles in 2004, just before, but we saw this in Star Trek back in 1966 as well. A little clunkier, needed a stylus, sort of drove the tablet PC thing towards stylus, and then those folks couldn't get rid of the stylus because that's the way it was supposed to be, until Apple came out with a better way. Or you could probably say Star Trek Next Generation came out with a better way because they got rid of the stylus and made it a touchscreen. So we see this happening all the time. We get unofficial, anecdotal examples where the development teams themselves are admitting to the influence that sci-fi had on the things that they created. Let's look a little bit at social context, and mostly I'm going to talk about anthropomorphism because there's lots of cool things around the anthropomorphism that we see in science fiction and how they show up as a result in products. So let me go back here for a sec. Here's a collection of one company's forays into anthropomorphism. They've probably done more experimentation, not even experimentation. They get stuff to market for better or for worse, out on the market. There are these anthropomorphized things, and all the research for this was done like half a mile that way by Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves in the communications department at Stanford. All their research is at the basis for Microsoft's forays into this area. And they're really interesting. Is anyone here from Microsoft? I really appreciate Microsoft's work in this area. The problem that they have often is that because of the culture inside the company, the implementation always sort of falls short. So Bob is annoying as hell. So is Clippy. In fact, when Clippy finally went away, and it took like a decade of complaining for Clippy to finally die, and people held sort of the death of Clippy parties all over the world. It wasn't that having an anthropomorphized agent was bad. It was the implementation of it was such that he was just an annoying jerk, right? So no different than, if you had a coworker who's an annoying jerk. It's not that the person's bad or it's bad to have a coworker, just not that coworker. And this raises the issues around anthropomorphism, which are, if you're going to do this, it's really hard to do it right. Anyone ever see Ms. Dewey? This is from 2006. One person, you're like the first, a couple people, right on. So what was your experience of Ms. Dewey?
I was actually mentoring
Really?
so I remember using
Oh, so you might be able to answer the burning question of why did they make her? Oh, no, I don't have, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Her, not Ms. Dewey. This is awesome. I've always wanted to meet someone that worked on this project or around this project. So Ms. Dewey, for the rest of you, is a video agent front end to a search engine. And what you don't see here is that there's just a search field, just like in Google. You can put in, interfaces in SciFi, and then up comes a text list of everything that you would find in Google or now Bing, et cetera, except at the top are these little videos of Ms. Dewey. So my two big questions: why is she dressed like that, and what is the theme of that? Do you know?
So all I can really say is that these people are scientists and they're pushed to publish constantly. So if you're going to do that, you might as well have some fun.
Well, I don't get I get the fun, sexy, whatever, but is that like a evening maid outfit, like a formal maid outfit?
Honestly, that outfit doesn't look familiar. I've seen other outfits that maybe make a little more sense. She looks more Jetsons in the outfits I've seen.
So not here. Yeah, I just can't figure that out. The other problem is she's actually sort of smiling, smirking here, but most of the video when I used her, maybe that says something about my search, is that she sort of hops around. She's sort of, and she's kind of a bitch.
Oh, well, so she's waiting for you to tell her what to search for.
Right,
and she has to kill time somehow. And for some reason, they wanted to make her kind of snotty. I don't know why.
Yeah, she's naughty. I mean, that's probably, thank you, that's a nicer way of saying it. Like, if you're going to do this, why would you make a snotty person rather than someone that was maybe more ingratiating?
Wouldn't that be boring, though? I mean, there's a long history of women being kind of jackassy in computers. If you go back to like the 50s and 60s
because they're all made by
television,
men, right?
I can't remember the first reference, but one that comes to mind is Battle Beyond the Stars. Came out in like '79. Oh, okay. Exactly. So there actually are several examples of at least female voices. There's also an episode in Star Trek, the classic version, where they tell her, snotty female computer, and it's actually Majel, what's her face's voice. But anyway, they just did it differently. So actually, this just has a precedent.
Well, you're right. It does a precedent, but the interesting thing is, in a film or a TV episode like Star Trek, for instance, you can control the narrative around it, right? Like, it's only going to be for so long. You can set up the context. You can control the reactions that the often men but other people have. In this kind of situation, you can't. So it's already difficult to play this anthropomorphism game. To play it this way is just sort of insane, because you can't control how people are going to react. So you would think that most people would want to default to something that is maybe going to work for a lot more people.
Yeah, I can't say they did any user experience on her personality, but also another thing comes to mind is that this was in Seattle, and one of the dominant female personalities that is widely admired is the goth hipster, and especially if you go into downtown Seattle.
That's great insight, actually. Yeah, thank you. In any event, so we should move on. This is one example, and these four examples with Bob and Clippy were by and large not seen as successful in the market. I'm going to show you an example where anthropomorphism is seen as successful.
You have 3 messages. Your graduate research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a...
So what makes this agent maybe a little more palatable and feeling a little more real, as this is speculative fiction, right? This might as well be science fiction. It was 1987, and we're only now really seeing things like agents and series and whatnot in the interface. What makes this work is that Phil isn't rendered particularly photoreal. He's rendered just real enough that he looks kind of human, but we know it's not human. And he's very plain looking. And even his personality, he's sort of devoid of personality, but even his voice and intonation is pretty flat. And all of that is telegraphing to us as users, or viewers in this case, that he's kind of, he's got some functionality, but he's not a whole person. We can't expect him to do everything that a person can, because there's the resolution that he's portrayed in, and I mean that visually as well as interaction-wise and other things, is downgraded from a person. And that's sort of what makes this work. He's interruptible in a way that you would never sort of, maybe that's a nice way to do it, but you don't tend to interrupt people that way. Like stop, and then they pick up as if nothing's wrong and he's not offended. So this tends to be a much more realistic and a much more successful way to handle this. Right, so I'll repeat that for the recording. He doesn't trigger the Frankenstein reaction that sort of Clippy and other people do. Well, and his behavior is not aggressive, etc. So let's move on to some issues around this area. I maintain that sound is enough to carry this anthropomorphic
Bridge to
effect.
Commander Riker. Picard to Commander Riker. Answer, please. Computer, locate Commander Riker.
Commander Riker is in his quarters.
So this is a very common clip from Star Trek, right? Why is the computer rendered with a very human sounding, not a voice like this, a very human sounding voice and a voice recognition system? They can speak to it, it can speak to them. It does a couple things. One is it telegraphs to the audience that this is a really sophisticated, intelligent system. Even if it's not as intelligent as it actually sounds, or appears to, especially novice users or naive users, it appears that way simply because of the rendering of the voice, in this case because it's sound only. I'm going to show you a quick example where this is true even when there's no voice. It's a little bit dark, but hopefully you can see this, and you all know this scene. Okay, what's he feeling? He's a little scared, right? He doesn't even have a voice. So R2-D2 is arguably probably the most beloved character in the entire Star Trek or Star Wars universe. He's arguably the best acted. And all of the personality that allows us to empathize and connect with him is carried not even by voice, it's just a couple clicks and buzzes, right? So that's, to me, the proof that this stuff works even without a representation, because he doesn't look particularly human. I mean, he kind of has two arms, but that's pretty much stretching it. So when we use sound in the interface, we can play this game. A, we should be aware of it. B, we can play it really, really high, or we can play it kind of light if we don't want to overstep our, we see it in Knight Rider, and I'm not going to go through any of them. Sometimes behavior is enough, and I maintain that something like one click is essentially an anthropomorphized system behaviorally. Because what does that do when you click on it? It trusts you, it knows who you are, it recognizes who you are, and says, I'll just take care of the details. It's like a concierge or a bartender when you walk in, and the bartender's already making your favorite drink before you even get to the bar, because he knows you. He trusts that he's making the right thing, and if not, then he'll eat it and it's not your problem. All that wraps into a human-like behavior, even though there's no person represented in the interface, either visually or auditorily. But if you're going to play this game, it works with animals too. This is Bounty Bear, which is another search engine. Again, I'm sort of losing time here, so I'm going to skip ahead. However, everything I just said is true about behavior and audio.
And many of them are so inert,
but when you play this game, the more real you do bother to make the visuals, that just heightens out everything, heightens all the expectations, it heightens all the assumptions made about the intelligence of the system, for instance. Why is Agent Smith so dangerous, or the twins, or why is, for that matter, the Oracle so prescient? Why do we even accept that the Oracle, which is just a bunch of lines of code, So why do we accept that this program could possibly be prescient and predict the future? Because we aren't fooled that she's not real, but our shorthand is she's a person, she's sophisticated, she's indistinguishable from the other characters. They can't tell the difference between who's a program and who isn't. And that leads us into expectations that they are more powerful than they probably are, especially in the case of the Oracle. They have capabilities that match us or exceed us, et cetera, in a way that this wouldn't happen if you walked up to an ATM terminal and said, tell me the future, and it spit out in characters something that was identical basically to what she's saying. It changes our expectations of what's going on and what's capable. So, and a lot of that is because of the uncanny valley. How many people here know about the uncanny valley? Okay, it's worth talking about. Basically what the uncanny valley says, and this comes from Masahiro Mori, if you look at realism, if you're playing the realism game with humans, or if it's animal for stuffed animal toys, both in behavior, movement, action, interaction, as well as visuals. We could do the same thing for sound. He says familiarity is, I think that's sort of a mistranslation. It's really more acceptance of reality, of this thing being sort of realness. It grows, it gets better as the likeness gets more real, as the resolution gets more indistinguishable from human. But this weird thing happens on both curves, interaction and visual. It sort of rises and then it hits this valley, it drops really badly. And then right at the end when it gets indistinguishable from humans, like we see in The Matrix, then it gets cool again, then it gets great, in fact. And what's happening here is our queasiness around things that kind of are human, but obviously wrong in some way. So those creepy robots that you see, or those real dolls, not everyone is affected by these, the same amount of resolution. Corpses, which are in fact human, but have lost life and have lost their animation, are sort of sickening to us and repulsive to us. And so if you play this game, you have to be aware that this valley exists too, because if you don't get far enough up that slope, or, if you're over here, you're cool. Once you get here, you're in the danger zone, and then it's really hard to get out up to the top of the valley. That's what's going on there. So I'm almost out of time. I'm going to show you a few lessons that we've seen. The first here is that constraints ease learning curves. This is particularly good for novices, or when you haven't used a system for 1,000 years.
Well, should be fine.
Or 2,000 years.
You know how all this works? Theoretically, yes. Theoretically? Now that the four stones should go around, the fifth element should be in the middle, and then the weapon against evil should work.
You've never seen this work before, have you?
No.
The weapon has a manual. I'm sure this has one too.
That's it. Match up the symbols. Go, go!
Okay, so the instructions are in the form, which is essentially what we've been trying to do for years with instruction manuals. Now you don't even get one, it's sort of in the help system. But to whatever extent people don't need to refer to the instruction manuals is great when the form is communicating the story. That's the positive example. Here's the negative example. It's also a really cool interface joke. This is Lifted. It was a short that I think preceded the film Ratatouille. All the establishing shots that tell us, holy crap, this is not the interface. This is not what we do. So this is, as interface designers, we don't get jokes like this very often. We have to sort of cherish them. There's actually a couple here in Lifted. This is the opposite of, the form of the interface communicating. There's not even labels on these buttons. I'm going to cross this one and go to the last one here. This is a really interesting lesson that we found that we never expected to find, and it is awesome. In Star Wars, holography has a consistency.
What is thy bidding?
So when Darth Vader is talking to the Emperor is this gigantic disembodied head that clearly is, many times bigger than Darth Vader, but just later, when Darth Vader turns to a stormtrooper who is also holographic, the stormtrooper is smaller, projected smaller than Darth Vader. What's going on here? Well, that's their social structure, and the interface is acknowledging and representing differences in scale based on social structure. Well, you can imagine where we're going with this. When you look at the Jedi Council, meets in a circle.
A partial message was intercepted in a diplomatic packet from the chairman of Budapest.
When they meet, the scale is all the same. Why? Because they are all equals. And this is essentially a lesson that we can all take into our own interface work. If you're doing any kind of communications, I know Uday from Citrix is here. When people are represented in the interface, you can play with scale to either acknowledge social hierarchy or, let's face it, transgress it, like play around, like maybe the speaker of the webinar is really small and everyone else is big or not, right? This is a lesson that we can clearly take because it mostly works here for the audience. There's a couple instances, like in the crowded cockpit, where it's not that case. But it works here because it works narratively, it works socially for us, it makes sense to us, and it's telegraphing meaning for us. And even though it's not a lesson that they predetermined for the use of Star Wars, it's still a lesson that we can pull away and put into our own work. And that sort of sets up the first meta lesson that we've learned, I'm almost out of time, in our 5 years of studying this stuff, is that if it works for an audience, it will likely work for a user. Now there's exceptions where that's not the case. But for the most part, if it's working in a narrative setting, meaning a film or a television episode, it will often work in an interface because an interface is a kind of narrative. This sets up the second meta lesson that we've learned, which is all design is fiction. Now, I don't think we'd command the salaries that we command or have the importance that we would have if we let everyone know this, but the reality is almost everything we do in design is fiction. You go do your research and you create personas. They don't exist. They're fictional. They're characters. Then you take them through scenarios. Those don't exist either. They're narratives. And almost everything we do, we create prototypes and we iterate, we test them, iterate it, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the stuff we work on never even sees the light of day. Moment of silence for this place. Unless a couple things that we work on actually make it out into the market. And then it switches from fiction to fact. And then people can be influenced by it and they can be successful or not, et cetera. But 90% of our job is fiction. And that's why this works, this investigation from SciFi works for designers, because we're already doing fiction. And these are fiction tools. And then we can use them as such. We will rename them and make them sound more important. But essentially, we can take these kinds of investigations to learn our craft or reinvigorate or learn things about what we do, and especially people, because there's people in there and there's people in our world. We just have to be a little careful about the transposition, because sometimes we see stuff like Minority Report, where everyone now wants this, interface, which is totally not going to work, right? Because your arms get tired. And how do you tweet like this or text or work on a spreadsheet? We don't know. We're actually building a pigeon language out of what we see in gesture interfaces. But the piece that you don't see as the audience is how it was made, and you don't realize that they had to stop filming that scene constantly. They had to take breaks because Tom Cruise's arms would get tired. And if you don't know that, then you think this is appropriate. So we have to be careful about the transpositions of some of these lessons, because they might lead us in the wrong way. But in general, we have almost 200 lessons in the book, which won't be out until August. But though they're real lessons that we can take into our work. And that's really the big lesson of what we found that legitimized. We had a hunch that this stuff would be valuable, and it turned out to be so, thankfully. But there's other genres that you can do this with. We've just identified one, science fiction. You could go to other speculative forms of fiction. You could go to game design. And I don't just mean like computer games, but you can pull lessons from the game world, for instance, and put it back into the non-game interface world. We've identified about 6 or 7 categories of media that you could do the same kind of investigation and find real stuff that enriches what you do. So it's really hot in here, and I'm out of time, so I'm going to end it here. I know that we have a little bit of an intermission, and so while the next speaker sets up, I'm happy to go answer questions out there, but thank you very much. Yes.
So in the anthropomorphizing, there's a big issue having to do with the appropriateness of the interaction.
Mm-hmm.
As in my favorite Clippy cartoon, where he says, "Hi, I see you're writing a suicide note. Let me help you."
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a great moment in sort of pop culture, sci-fi, or interface commentary. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could explain something that's long puzzled me. In a lot of these movies with robots, the robot's eyes glow, like you were saying, that everything has to glow, especially the eyes glow, which obviously is the opposite of what the eyes should be doing, but yet it's meeting some kind of psychological need there. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's just anthropomorphism, right? Like, if they bothered to have eyes, R2-D2 doesn't have eyes, and it still works for us. In fact, it works. He's much less annoying than C-3PO. And let's not get into the fact that C-3PO can talk, but R2-D2 can. I mean, that just makes no sense. But what's happening there is, if you bother to have eyes, you need to make sure people can see them, which means they have to either light up themselves or light up around them, because one of the other things about science fiction is it tends to be really dark. So you don't even see people's eyes very easily unless they've configured the lighting so that you can. And I think it's really just to show you, it's to reinforce this animation, this animateness, and then the second thing is that's how you tell if they're on or not.
It seems like, I mean, the humans on this set, their eyes aren't glowing.
Yeah.
Right, and
we accept all sorts of weird things as humans, especially when it comes to fiction, to sort of be triggers that are telling us things. Yeah. But I think it's just literally to make sure you get their eyes. Get it? There's a lot of hitting your head over and over to make sure you got the joke or you got the thing, especially in sci-fi.
I see.
Hi there, Nathan.
Yeah.
My name's Diane. And I guess I've got a question. When you're doing your research, you're basing it off of movies that have already been published and are readily available. I guess I'm curious to know if you actually go in and talk with the people who actually do the development as what their intent was.
Yeah, in some cases there's published accounts, like the Motorola development team for the StarTAC. But we have contacted a lot of the production designers, the people that literally worked on either the props or the screens. Most of them don't like to talk a lot about what they do because they don't want to give you any of their secrets. But some of them, like Mark Colleran, are fairly forthcoming.
I guess the question is kind of, do they base it off of some scientific information that they collected, or do they kind of do their own interpretations?
Generally not. Generally it's, especially in most sci-fi, there's very few films where the director and the producer really care about, accuracy or reality. 2001 is probably the great example of that, or it wasn't Mission to Moon, Destination Moon maybe? It's an older film from the 60s that cared enough, and then there's 2001, and then there's sort of Minority Report. So every now and then you have a team of filmmakers that do sit and they hire futurists and engineers and designers to come in and talk about what would be an accurate kind of future. But for the most part, the vast majority of sci-fi, and even in some of those films, like when it gets to the screen production, they still want to wow you, right? Most of it's just sort of visual coolness.
Abracadabra.
Style, yeah.
Okay.
I have a thought about robots' eyes glowing, actually. One of the uncanny valley things, humans' eyes are reflective. Non-reflective eyes are very uncanny valley.
They're dead, yeah. That's a really good point. Thank you. There's one here. Right in front.
Hey there. I take all my design cues from Futurama, just so you know.
Futurama, by the way, has the best commentary on sex bots, and we have a whole another presentation on that. And it's online. You go to YouTube.
Which
and
is
watch
given
it.
a
Great.
different venue, I assume.
I'm sorry?
That presentation is given at a different venue.
Usually after midnight.
Two things. There is actually a special light put on the actor's eyes in movies to make the eyes pop out. So they do sort of glow a little bit. And there's an effect you frequently will see where the person's face is in shadow, but there just happens to be a beam of light right across their eyes.
Sort of the Pris effect, opposite of, yeah.
And then just not quite a throwaway, but it looked like you skipped over a clip from Babylon 5?
No.
Okay, never mind.
Oh, you just lost all your sci-fi cred.
But you did, but you did say something that seemed to be internally contradictory. At one point you said Microsoft spent a lot of time doing market research, and then you said their stuff didn't work because they kind of sucked at it. It sounds like they proved it doesn't work.
No. So they funded a lot of research at Stanford, which I would not call market research. It was really core user research. And if you want to read that research, the Media Equation by Nass and Reeves is brilliant and goes through all of it. And one of the grad students was B.J. Fogg, who then went on to create the Captology Lab here at Stanford. All of that research is great research, and they've proven that it works. I think it was the implementation of that research that fell flat. Things like Ms. Dewey, which will work for a small segment of the population because there's sort of 8 personality types that people use, but they choose the one that sort of had the lowest incident rather than going for something that maybe crossed 2 or 3 of the most mainstream. Their choices essentially coded for annoyance for the majority of users, although they probably did work for certain slim combinations or segments of users. But it's actually all well-founded research. It's very impressive, in fact. Okay, good. Go. Great. Sorry, I went a little over.